Si sente? Sì. No, no, forse non si vede. No, non si vede. Sì. Inizio magari a fare lo sharing del... Ok.
Perché poi vedo le mie diapo.
Sì, si vede tutto. Perfetto. Adesso. Tu sarai in piedi, giusto?
Sì, mi sa di sì.
Ok.
Vado avanti con questo.
Prova solo a cambiare per piacere le slide. Comincio. Sì. Solo vedere che... Okay. Dovrebbe essere non mutato. Quindi. Andrea, ci senti?
Sì, vi sento bene.
Perfetto.
Vi sento bene.
Okay, so welcome everybody to this new session, the first session of this new year of the Mumble seminars. It's a great pleasure to have here today our colleague and friend Stefano Predelli from the University of Nottingham. He is here right now, by the way, which is quite uncommon and unusual for him, for as anybody knows, I guess that this is your most quoted paper, I guess, that was published in 1998, if I remember correctly, on analysis, this paper called I'm Not Here Now, which was very much inspiring in the study of the functioning of indexicals. But as you know, Stefano is a great philosopher of language. I've just learned that he has published 4 books, at least 4, in philosophy of language topics, starting from Context of 2005, in which he defends a sort of minimalist or anti-contextualist position on the semantics-pragmatics divide. Then passing to Meaning Without Truth, 2013, in which he discusses the theme of extra or ultra truth conditional meanings, such as implicatures, for instance. Another book of 2017 on proper names, in which he destroys, unfortunately, the indexicalist view on proper names. And last but not least, a book that I found very much inspiring and with which, in a way, I'm very much sympathetic, which is Fictional Discourse, on the functioning of the fictional discourse and proper names in fiction, that came out 2 years ago by Oxford University Press. He's also an expert in aesthetics, by the way. He has published some papers on the ontology of music, on performances, on musical performances, but his main topic is philosophy of language. And in fact, today he's talking to us about true scare quotes, a conversational analysis.
Oh, right.
The floor is yours.
Okay, so I can stand up and walk a little bit. Thank you very much to all the people involved in having me here and to all the people who bothered to come. And I see some known names among the people who are connected remotely. So hello to Vera and Massimiliano and everybody else. Okay, so very nice to be here. Always very generous. I'm not sure I will repay your hospitality with a very polished paper. The usual caveat is that this is very much work in progress. I don't know that there's very much progress going on, and I'm not even sure there's much work going on in this. But anyway, it's a topic. It's a deliberately frivolous topic, scare quotes. But I hope to show, I mean, the theory of quotation is much more important than many people who are not involved in semantics might think. And among the theorists of quotation, it's common to say, well, there's many types of quotation. One where probably we philosophers don't have much to say is scare quotes. And I would like to prove them wrong and to use this phenomenon as an excuse for something in the theory of conversation that perhaps would prove useful for the analysis of more momentous topics in philosophy of language and semantics. Okay, so as you can see, the topic is officially not scare quotes, but what I call true scare quotes. And so I begin with a very informal introduction of the phenomenon that I think is, well, that will be at issue in my talk. Because the idea of scare quotes comes from manuals of style, from informal approaches to languages. It's kind of unsurprising that it doesn't really define a natural kind, if you want to put it like that, in semantics. And in fact, I will begin with a few definitions of the phenomenon. I will claim they mix up a few things, and I will select some of those things as my topic. And that phenomenon is what I call true scare quotation, by the way. I will say something a little bit about quotation marks, the quotes, as I go along, but my topic is that which is signaled by some uses of quotation marks. So here's the informal preliminary, right? So scare quotes, in a sense, and I'm trying to explain very pre-theoretically what that sense is, and then I try to give you my picture, and I'll tell you why it's a best picture of the phenomenon. And as I said, yes, it's a frivolous topic, but it's an excuse to introduce some ideas in the theory of conversation. I'll get to that later on. So here are some common definitions from manuals of styles, from Wikipedia, from common folk about what scare quotes are. Here is the OED, which is kind of a dignified source. Scare quotes are used to foreground a particular word or phrase. And by the way, speaking of quotation marks, that's probably all they have in common. We use them in many different ways, and they just foreground a particular word or phrase. But here, in this case, especially with the intention of disassociating the user from the expression, or from some implied connotation it carries. Okay, fine. I guess that's what many of us think as scare quotes being about. And Wikipedia says something roughly along the same lines. Speakers place scare quotes around the word to signal that they are using it in an ironic, referential, or otherwise non-standard sense. Well, these are different things, right? So we'll get to that. Scare quotes may indicate that the author is using someone else's term, similar to preceding a phrase with the expression so-called. That's kind of interesting. They may imply skepticism or disagreement, or belief that the words are misused. There's quite a bunch of different ideas here. Here is another guy from the net, I think I got this one. What occurs within scare quotes is not a quotation from anyone in particular, but merely a term which is used by some people. What the writer is doing here is distancing himself from the term in quotes. Right, so here you find at least two conceptual poles. One which I briefly summarized along these three little points, and I do so only to set it aside. The only one which is a little bit less prominent in those quotations is the one that will be my true topic. Okay, so here is what you get from those passages. First of all, that when you put things in what they call scare quotes, you have some sort of echoic element. It's a little bit like a quotation in the sense of a citation, usually without a particular target in mind, right? The expression is used by, as one of the definitions, some people. It's not my use of the term, I'm echoing somebody else's use of the term. And I do so, and this would seem the characteristic bit of this sense of scare quotes, as opposed to, I suppose, straightforward mixed quotation. There's a dissociating element. I echo it in order to tell you how much I dislike it, in order to, I don't know, make fun of it, distance myself from what those people have said when they used that word. And in fact, I don't just disassociate myself, I perhaps even disagree with that use of the term. Fine, that's right, that's surely how quotation marks are often used, and how quotation marks are often used in cases which traditional wisdom wants to call scare quotes. No objection to the use of terminology. And here is a classic example. This piece of art consists of a large canvas covered with mud. Okay, so somebody who says something like that in the sense to which in the sense of scare quotes to which I alluded, is trying to make fun of the people who are calling that thing art, right? They call it art, but in fact it's just a piece of nothing, a piece of mud and canvas, right? So here you hint at someone else's use of art. And indeed, here you can use what one of those quotations mentioned as a substitute for scare quotes, the so-called. This piece of so-called art, in fact, is not art. Right? That's pretty much the idea here. So this hint at someone else's use of art signals the writer's disassociation from and disagreement with that use. Fine. Remember, I'm still exploring the sense in which I'm not interested in, right? And here's the interesting bit here. If I say this, I am disagreeing with the people who described the object as art because I don't think it's art. And so precisely, I disagree with their use of art because I disagree with their use of art with their standard use of art. I don't think the thing is art, which is what art usually denotes. Right? So I disagree with the content. Call it art, call it with any synonym. I've got qualms with the word because of the meaning of the word, because I don't think the thing is art. Right? And so I disassociate myself from the word art because the canvas is not deemed to be art, the standard designatum of art. Okay? So far so good, I suppose, since that's not my topic. But there's something else going on in those quotations, in those definitions of scare quotes, which will be my true topic. Okay, so let's start and let's take a look at some snippets from those quotations and notice how they seem to allude, gesture towards a different idea of what's going on, which will be what I call true scare quotation and which will be my topic. Wikipedia talks of a word used in a non-standard sense. Well, that surely didn't apply to the common reading of one, where art was supposed to stand for art, namely its most standard sense of all, right? And the Chicago Manual Style, to cite another source, speaks of the application of a standard term in a non-standard way. Okay, that's not what happened in the case of one, at least in the common understanding of one, where I most definitely wanted to use art in the standard way, to speak of art, in order to distance myself from the description of the canvas as a piece of art. Okay, so there's another understanding of scare quotes here. And it's the understanding that I think you find in those manuals of style, you know, those that tell you how to speak and write properly. We all make fun of that. It's linguistically not dignified, okay? But the HarperCollins Concise Dictionary tells you don't use scare quotes. Why? Because when you do that, you're using a term in a non-standard way, and you shouldn't, right? Spend a little bit more time, find the right word, and use it without apology. And so scare quotes should be out of proper formal writing. Okay, I got no, sympathy for this sort of prescriptions, but the prescription targets precisely the non-standard use of a term, which wouldn't seem to be at issue in the case of one, at least in its standard reading. And so here, the idea is that when you put a term in scare quotes, you disassociate yourself from the expression. Yes, that's what's common to all instances of scare quotation, but in this case with the very expression, not with what it stands for standardly, right? So you have a term, you using it non-standardly, not according to the dictionary, if you like. And then you have this little flag that says, I don't like the word. Okay. The Chicago Manual of Style gives you this example, and that's the example I'm going to use because it's there and it's the clearest. It's perhaps not the most colloquially accessible, so I'll say something a little bit about this. In offset printing, proofs of illustrations come from the darkroom. Okay. Now, I grant that you could interpret 2 as we did 1. Somebody, some fool, called them proofs of illustration. We know they're not proofs. Proofs are of text. What is appropriate for illustrations is galleys. Okay, so I'm making fun of this person. That's an option, okay? The standard option that we discussed. But the one that interests me is a different one. No, I'm not echoing anybody. I'm not really speaking about so-called proofs. They are not so-called. It's me, the speaker, who can't remember this technical term, galleys. And so I do the best I can and then flag it with the quotation marks, right? So, okay, I'm going to call them proofs. Don't go and look in the dictionary. You won't find what I have in mind. It's the best I can come up with. Come on. Do a little bit of common sense reasoning. You people in the printing business know the right term, right? All I can do is to flag my non-standard use. So 2 could be in the vicinity of 1. Some source classified those things among the proofs, and there are reasons for disagreeing with that characterization. They're not really proofs. They're not really the sort of thing which proofs standardly stands for. Okay, an option. But the one that interests me is another one. No echoic intent. I'm not making fun of anybody. If anything, I'm making fun of me. Right? I can't come up with the right term. Allow me to use this term, proof, in a non-standard way, i.e. as synonymous with galleys, the term I can come up with. And let me be honest, right? I recognize on the page with those quotation marks that the term is really not the right one. I just couldn't come up with anything better than that. Okay, that's the sort of thing that the manuals of style are against, right? No, be more prudent, shut up until you find the right word, go and look it up, and then speak without any apology. Galleys is the word you wanted, not proofs. Okay? So here, in the case that interests me, the writer, the speaker. Oh, by the way, yeah, the writer, of course. But in speaking, you've got the intonation, I presume. Anyway, the writer may have realized that on that occasion proofs the word was inappropriate. Being unable to come up with the right word, she settled for the best she could find and apologetically recognized her less than optimal performance. Okay, it's a phenomenon. Surely it's a phenomenon, right? Many times, even us very educated people can't come up with the right word, and many times under pressure, we feel like we use a word that we know it's not exactly the right one and invite the audience to be a little bit generous and come up with the right interpretation. And on top of that, it's a phenomenon that is alluded by certain snippets from those quotation informal descriptions of scare quotes that I mentioned above, right? So yeah, the phenomenon is there. Would be surprising if it weren't there, by the way. And so I call it true scare quotations, and that's my topic. To repeat, a sense of scare quotes consistent with a common prescription that if you think a word is appropriate, use it without any quotes, and if you think it's not appropriate, don't use it, right? These manuals of style that tells you, forget about true scare quotes, those are bad. Those are just an admission of you being incompetent. Right? Because surely that recommendation will be clearly out of place for one in the way in which I invited you to read it, right? A sort of almost mixed quotation kind of thing, right? Because there, if I wanted to make fun of somebody's description of the canvas as art, surely art is the right term to use, right? So why shouldn't I do that, right? That would be a kind of attribution of speaking to somebody else, which is surely fine, right? What should be wrong with that? Instead, these people tell you don't do the stuff when you try to do it in the sense of true scare quotation, when you are admitting your incompetence as a speaker in a way. And so I call it true scare quotation. You can call it whatever you want, right? It's just that I couldn't come up with a term. The phenomenon is there, usually subsumed under scare quotes. It's a special phenomenon. It's the phenomenon that interests me more than its manifestation, the manifestation being the quote or the intonation. And so I bypass the whole thorny thing of the relationship between the first sense of scare quotes to which I alluded, my true scare quotations, and for that matter, all of the other many ways in which we use quotation marks. Okay, that's a big issue. That's a topic. Many people would like a unified theory of quotation marks. I find it a little bit hopeless, like looking for a unified theory of the comma, right? Where you're trying to, for example, have a theory of the comma qua indicator of parentheticals and the comma qua separator of decimal points in a number, right? Punctuation is a mess, right? But I'm not bothered by that. But anyway, if you have a theory that shows me that deep down there are interesting relationships between my true scare quotes, the other sense of scare quotes, mixed quotation, pure quotation, and the quotation mark we put around the title of a paper in a bibliography, fantastic. That would be the unified theory that would surprise everybody, but fine, I'm not trying that, right? So I'm just dealing with the phenomenon more than the graphic manifestation of the thing. Okay. So I would like to give a theory of true scare quotation and try to show why it is a little bit more interesting than it might appear. And so here I go. Now, my framework is in the theory of conversation. Now, scare quotes, a theory of conversation. Yeah, oh my God, it's not really a theory, right? It's informal. Now, there are a few symbols, okay, but you'll see that the symbols are a little bit sloppy for pedagogical reasons and probably that the theory is kind of a first approximation to what is going on. But let's see, right? And then you tell me if it is at least a first approximation or if it is completely off the mark. Okay, so I have to remind you a little bit about the theory of conversation. Yeah. So now, I've been told that some of you are not exactly fans of the semantics of quotation or of the theory of conversation. So I will explain things. Don't be offended if you think I'm treating you as an undergraduate. Better do that. And by the way, in doing the very simple presentation, you see how I understand things, and you might tell me, look, that's not how things should be understood. Okay. Right, so what I have in mind, of course, is Stolnecker and all that industry, right? Now, in that industry, conversations are modeled as a series of states. So, me and Alberto are engaged in a conversation, and at that point in the conversation, we kind of agreed on something. Right? We had that bunch of information as common ground. Right? Then I say something new. London is in England. Alberto says yes, and our common ground intuitively grows, right? Okay, so now you also have that as something that we start taking for granted, that London is in England. Okay, and so the idea is this, right? You have this update, you have a state, and then in brackets, the effect of my utterance, and what you get is a new state, right? Okay, a state in which the common ground grows. Okay, since these people like Stolnecker and everybody else perfectly fine here, fortunately, not anywhere else, but here, it's fine to think of information as sets of possible worlds, right? The sets of possible worlds compatible with what I said, right? So in fact, rather than augmenting the common ground, I've got a chair here. I'm not sitting. what I call growing common ground is in fact shrinking, right? Because I add information and so I reduce the set of possible worlds compatible with what I'm saying. And so you get an intersection. Obviously, intersections, non-trivial intersections make things smaller, right? So after me and Alberto have agreed that London is in England, the set of possible worlds shrinks. I throw out all the possible worlds in which London is somewhere else. And we go on and on and on, and shrink and shrink and shrink until we say goodbye, and we've got this sort of more informative common ground than we've left. Of course, it can be false common ground, right? I can say London is in France and Alberto agrees, and so we go on with that common ground. Too bad, but okay. Right, so phi, what is phi? Phi is, of course, the content, the proposition expressed by, for example, my sentence, London is in England, right? Where sigma is the antecedent common ground and phi is the proposition expressed by my sentence. The sentence is out of the update clause. The sentence is there, yes, I had to make sounds. I had to say it out loud if Alberto was a bit hard of hearing. I had to use exactly those words as opposed to some synonymous ways, but who cares, right? And we are there to exchange information. That's a classic Stonakerian picture of conversation. Now, of course, for assertoric uses of London is in England, if I ask whether London is in England, I surely don't increase common ground. I do something else to common ground. And the theory of questions will tell you exactly what I do. If I tell Alberto, close the door, I do something else. I'm not doing anything to common ground, but I'm doing something to the to-do list and all of those things. Maybe I'm trying to implicate something, and so it's not the literal. Okay, right? We all know these things need to be fixed. They don't matter so much for me. What matters a little bit more is that really the effect of my utterance for anybody. Stolmaker, I think, says it only once, but it's so obvious. Is to propose an update. It's not that I have a final authority and Alberto is there drinking everything I pour on him, right? He can say yes, and then we go on, or he can say no, and then we have to try to repair the common ground and see what's happening there, right? So a proposal to enrich common ground. Okay. The thing that matters for me is that S is completely out of the picture. It's on the in the picture up here and up here. But really what does the update is the proposition. Yeah? So it's a little bit as if me and Alberto, were we angelic minds, we would just transfer propositions. Unfortunately, we are human, we have to make sounds with a meaning and so on, but that, come on, that's not the point of a conversation. Okay, this last bit is what I will try to rectify a little bit. So here is Stonemaker, right? I'm not criticizing Stonemaker, I would be foolhardy to do so. He says, look, when the semantics of the language is common ground, it will be manifest that an utterance with a certain meaning has been produced. So let's leave it out of the picture, right? That we speak English or Italian or whatever, it's the obvious nitty-gritty of the conversation. It's common ground. I know that Alberto knows that I know that he knows, blah, 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 about Italian or English. And really what matters is the proposition. That's the new thing. Did you say that London is in England? Did you propose that Paris is in France? Right? That's the stuff. So yes, if you want to, from this point of view, bring in the semantics of the language all the time, you won't achieve anything interesting, right, from the standard traditional view. So here is how you could rephrase the thing. Okay, you don't like propositions directly. You want to remind me that in a conversation you uttered a sentence that has a meaning. Previous state, utterance of S. And what I do, I enrich the previous common ground with the interpretation of S, with its meaning, with the proposition. Lambda is my symbol for the interpretation function. Right? Yeah, but look, lambda is just here, And at the next step, it will be, Alberto says S1, okay, lambda of S1. And so on. This lambda keeps on being dragged with no particular role to play. And so just forget about it and do like Stolnaker did, right? Phi, where phi is, of course, the lambda of the signal, of the S, right? That's the whole stuff. Okay, yeah. For many purposes, that's absolutely fine. But not for other purposes, and that's very important. So in this picture, lambda remains constant across the conversation. And that's pretty much the idea that as philosophers, right, we say, yeah, come on, let's speak in English or Italian. Me and Alberto don't need to remind me all the time. Jump to the proposition expressed in English or in Italian by your sentences, and you get everything fine, right? English or British English or whatever you want, our dialect or whatever. But anyway, the language carries across, just as an unavoidable means for bringing up propositions. Okay. Well, so now is the adjustment that I propose that eventually will turn out to be, I think, useful for the analysis of true-scale rotation, a more realistic picture of conversation. And the idea is that when we speak, we don't just update information, we don't just enrich our common ground. Formally, we don't just shrink the possible worlds, but we also constantly negotiate the way in which we do so. Right? A little bit like most of the times, the point is the message, but sometimes the medium is the message. Right? And we do this on the fly as we go. Okay, so, well, this is, of course, plain English, right? Yeah, I meet Alberto, and we start talking plain Italian. Right? I'm not going to be particularly prudent when it comes to gatto or è un mammifero. Right? When it comes to certain technical terms, maybe something that has to do with lutherie or I don't know, guitar techniques, I don't know, Alberto, does he know those words? I'm more tentative, right? And so I might try to spit it out and see how he reacts. Again, he's going to accept it or not. But now what I'm testing is not acceptance of information, but acceptance of the means of conveying information. So that's a case of difficult words. Now, of course, all of these are very informal terms, right? Plain English, difficult words. They're just there to give you a little bit of a picture. So I meet someone and, you know, we start with a little bit of hypothesis about people we meet, right? Even at the beginning, common ground is not empty, right? Of course, I know that Alberto knows that I know that he knows that humans don't fly and that sort of stuff. And of course, I know that he knows that I know blah, 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 how to use gatto or un mammifero, queste cose, right? And things like that. But then I can try, well, not Alberto is a bad example here, but my daughter, right? I can try this. Nephrologists are well paid. A little bit daring now. Now there's a difficult word here, right? So something happens there that has not so much to do initially with enriching information, but is a little bit like testing. Can I go on using nephrologist or should I tell them the kind of doctor that deals with, I don't know what. So with Alberto, I'm sure he will be completely nonchalant and go on, perhaps disagree with the content. No, they're not well paid. I have a nephrologist friend who's kind of poor. Right? Or he says, yeah, they are, and we continue, we have reached common ground. Great, right? With my daughter, perhaps there will be the sort of puzzled look, right? Who? Oops, conversational breakdown. Yeah, okay, I need to step out of the conversation. I was talking about doctors and their income. Well, I need to stop a little bit and start talking about English. Look, that's a fancy word for people like Dr. Smith, you know, okay? All right, I got it. Ready? Let's go back to the conversation. Nephrologists are well paid. Huh? So I need an adjustment.
So what are they actually doing? What are they actually doing?
Who?
The nephrologists.
They're being well paid.
Is this a word which actually exists in English?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, but What do they do?
Oh, I don't, good question. Kidney doctors.
Kidding.
Well, very good. Look, I was thinking nerves. Very ignorantly. Well, there you go. So I wasn't. Anyway, good question. Yes. In Italian too?
Sì, sì, sono reni.
Okay, kidney doctors, sorry. Right. What results is an update of linguistic allegiance. No longer just stupid plain English, but kind of fancy English. And that is achieved precisely by my use of this expression. A synonym wouldn't do the same effect, even though a synonym would be completely on a par when it comes to propositional update. So kidney doctors, very good, right? Kidney doctors are well paid, would make the same propositional proposal, which my daughter could accept or reject, but on top of that also brings up this word for conversation, and I'm testing whether the word can be used or whether we need to adjust our vocabulary a little bit, right? So normally we start with plain English and update as we proceed, right? And sometimes the repair would be too tedious to fix. I'm just not going to talk to my daughter about incompleteness of completeness of predicate logic and that sort of stuff, because the word on top of the concept will take too much time to enter our conversation. So we don't update just the state, the common ground, the bunch of propositions. We also update the function. The plain English gets enriched as I go along with these not so plain words. This is just for pedagogical purposes, right? This appeal to plain English, grant me that. And so it would be nice to have it represented in the representation of a conversational state. Conversational state is not just a bunch of propositions that at that stage we take for granted, but it's also the linguistic fragment that at that stage we feel confident, mutually, manifestly confident of using. And here is the story then. When you have a previous state and you utter something, you enrich, you get a richer language in a way. You get a richer arsenal of expressions, in my case, that can be used in the conversation. If the person assents, makes no big deal, doesn't stop me, doesn't go and rush for the dictionary, right? Then what happens is, I got a new language here. And the new language which interprets my sentence, of course, as usual. And here, this is just a proposition that nephrologists, AKA kidney doctors, are well paid. Okay. S is in the picture. S is crucial, right? S is not just their way bringer, qua carrier of propositional content, it's also their qua displayer of the linguistic resources that we're taking into consideration. Now it makes a little bit of sense to have an utterance of S here, as opposed to having just the proposition. It's not just what you say, but it's how you say it. Right? And so I call lambda star an interpretive update. Right? The new language which gets. Okay. And so, yes, that was the point I just made. This update is utterance sensitive. Now it's not just abstract propositions. I updated in my example plain English with interpretation of nephrologist because that's what I said. Had I said kidney doctor, which I assume is completely synonymous, I would have said the same thing, but I wouldn't have that. I wouldn't have achieved the update that I wanted. So, given a sentence containing a bunch of lexical items, here is the sloppiness, right? I'm not going to tell you that and it's supposed to be equal to or larger than 1, for example. All of these things that should be there, but that you understand what I mean. Come on, right? So I'm being a little bit. You have a sentence containing these lexical items, and what you get is an update sensitive to the sentence. Now I'm being a little bit more explicit. It's not just lambda star, a new one. Well, it's a new one achieved by that sentence. where this update is what I had before, together with interpretation of the items in that sentence. Okay, let me say a little bit about this formalism, this pseudo-formalism, so it's clear to everyone. Now, I conceive of lambda as a function. To begin with, I conceive of lambda as a function, so I'm ignoring ambiguity because the interpretation of English is not a function. Bank can go one way or can go the other. Set it aside. Ambiguity will return at the very end with some promissory note. And so I see the function as a set of pairs, right? It's a function where you have the word and its meaning, dog and dogs, nephrologist and nephrologist, and so on. Right? So when I speak, if everything was fine, if the person is happy, I achieve an enrichment of my previous interpretive function. Well, enrichment, many times this will be completely trivial, right? The union will be trivial because those things were already in. Fine. But in the interesting cases, it would be a non-trivial union. I add something. I add I sub 1, and maybe I sub 2, and so on, with all of their meanings, if all goes fine. And if not all goes fine, conversational breakdown, we go and look it up. We go and look it up. Yeah, that's the standard stuff, the standard thing that happens in standard conversations, right? You say a difficult word that I don't know, and I ask you what it means, of course, or I go and look it up in the dictionary. I appeal to what I call the global language. Yeah, okay, not so crucial. So what N for I in here, right? How did you update the interpretive function in the case of nephrologist? What meaning did you put in? Well, in the standard conversations, of course, nephrologist, what the word really means in English, according to the OED. So that's a classic scenario for temporary breakdown. My daughter looks puzzled, she doesn't know, and so she says, wait a minute, stop the conversation, I'm going to look it up. And then she comes back, it's like, okay, fine, let's go on. Nephrologist, good. On top of knowing that they are well paid, I've also learned a new word. That's pretty much the spirit of what happened here, right? Great, and so we appeal to the global language, the set language, the kind of thing that's out there, the kind of thing that Davidson at some point thought wasn't there, that, right? Which is obviously the OED. And so we have this double-barreled linguistic background in standard conversations. I speak with Alberto and we start with plain English. Well, knowing Alberto, something much more than plain English, with a bit of fancy philosophical words. I'm sure a bit of fancy words in, I don't know, art criticism and all of that stuff. I'm not gonna dare when it comes to, I don't know, guitar techniques and the history of country music, because maybe Alberto doesn't know a few of those words. And so that's right. And if he doesn't, standard conversation, he goes and looks it up in the dictionary. Okay, dictionary, you know. Right. So you get this. You update the language in a way consistent with the global language, right? I update, as I told you before, where all these things are already there in the dictionary. The dictionary tells me how to pair nephrologist with nephrologist, for example. And so I get this, because we are talking standard English. Okay? Now, I should mention that not all scenarios are standard, because this will be useful. I know, I still haven't gotten to true scale quotation, but that will be quick after I'm done with the preliminaries. Here is a non-standard conversation. I tell Alberto, nephrologs, which is not an English word, right? That's like transponster, if you remember Friends. And Monica says, that's not even a word, right? Yeah, but we do get along like that. And that's the stuff that gets Davidson excited and said, well, you don't even need the language, right? A nice derangement of epitaphs and all of that stuff. Okay, that's not lexical, those are set phrases, but it's the same story. So I said this. Now, Alberto, if I say this, has a few options. The first one is, don't do that. No, studied for many, many years just so that I can talk proper English. And so I'm not prepared to go along with you with the use of this term. I'm going to stick to Lambda, to global English. And if you refuse, I'm going to take a dictionary in front of you and say, look, that's the word, right? No, that's not the right word. Conversation in need of repair, right? I may say, yes, it is. And so, oh, stupid you, blah, blah, blah. Okay, we have to stop a little bit. Another thing that you can do is be a little bit more constructive. No, it's not the right word, and here is the right word. And so with proper intonation, italics, he says, oh, nephrologists are well paid. That's an interesting phenomenon, by the way, because, well, no, forget about it. I'm not going to say it. Right? So he challenges my four, we are in need of repair, and he also proposes the repair. And I can accept it or not, right? And then we get into, all of a sudden we get into a discussion. We started talking about the income of doctors, and all of a sudden we are outside of the conversation trying to repair and to decide how we're going to carry on. Nephrologists or nephrologists. Another thing that he can do is, nice guy that he is, okay, right? Yeah, I know what it means. It's not the right word. Let's hope my students don't hear me talk like this, but okay, yeah, nephrologs, yeah, I have a nephrolog friend, and so on. So now we have a conversation that proceeds not according to our allegiance to the global language, but to the temporary language, all of those things that, the updated language is no longer a subset of the global language, right? You get an IM, which is not part of English, because English doesn't even have that I, doesn't have even the sound nephrolog, let alone the interpretation I intended. But you somehow get there. How? Oh, big issue, I don't know, pragmatic psychology, I suppose. They will tell us, but you know, contextual clues, yeah, okay, it's not a word, but Stefano was talking about doctors, this term sounds a little bit like doctor, and so let me get along with his proposal, nephrologs, I know what you mean. And so you get this new mapping, nephrolog, nephrologist. Not part of the global language, but many times we manage to do so. Right? Another scenario. Oh yeah, and here is another scenario that finally brings me a little bit closer to the point I wanted to make. Here is one, right? Somebody, no apology, right? I tell Alberto, who's a renowned typographist or something, I say, in offset printing, proofs of illustrations come from the dark room. Now the sound is in English, fine, but not with the meaning I want, because proofs only apply to text, apparently, in this context. So I've been told. Those are supposed to be galleys. Right? So, same thing. A little bit harder from the viewpoint of conversational smoothness, because Alberto will have all the right to say, to think I'm talking about proofs of illustrations, and I am conceptually confused about typography, because proofs are one thing, galleys are another. Okay? And so you could say something like, no, there are no proofs of anything that comes from the dark room. Those are called those are galleys. Those are called galleys, okay? Or perhaps he's willing to go along, and that would be kind of lucky. It gets harder and harder, right? In this case, nephrologs at least wore its non-standard character on its face. Proofs, okay. If he's smart enough in interpersonal communication, he might guess what I mean, and he might do one of the previous things, correct me, propose a different linguistic update. Oh, no, galleys of illustration come from the dark room. Or it just goes along with my mistake. Yeah, he's an incompetent, but I know what the point is, and let me use proofs like that. Right? Well, it can get pretty difficult sometimes. Many times we're very good at that, but sometimes it gets pretty difficult. In fact, it gets very difficult in this case. In offset printing, proofs of illustration come from the darkroom, not the proof press. It gets difficult because here this is supposed to be interpreted non-standardly as galleys, but this isn't. Those things do not come from the place that produces proofs. So, you know, there is a standard use of proofs, presumably, and so in a sense, if Alberto decides to go along, he will have to be, careful though, because now sometimes we use proofs in its right sense, and sometimes in our updated language, we use it in his peculiar sense as a synonym of galleys. And so, difficult to keep track. Misunderstandings are likely to occur. Okay, well, yeah.
Lambda was a function though. Lambda was a function though.
Yeah, exactly. Now, of course, it breaks down because you have an ambiguity, actually. In this case, my lambda will have to add lambda and a disambiguation, right? Good. Gets messy. Okay, so you can see what I can do, right? If only, I mean, if I'm a happy ignoramus, I really think those are proofs, I just spit it out as I just did, and then we'll see. Maybe Alberto will correct me, maybe we'll get along in this little incorrect jargon. Right? But many times, it's like, I'm not sure. Right? And so let me signal it. Let me be standard by making my non-standard use explicit. What am I going to do? I'm not going to use proof. I'm going to use scare quote proof, scare quote. So, blissful ignorance versus struggling to find the right word. I don't know that galleys, that word there. I gotta come up with something, otherwise I can't make my point. Let me try this. I use a signal from the struggle, I use true square quotations, and I come up with this. In offset printing, proofs of illustration come from the dark room. Here, the nice thing is that even intonationally, which of course linguistically is the interesting bit, is not the graphical. Even intonationally, we have this kind of pause, typical of quotational scenarios, but also a little bit of an interrogative contour. Right? In offset printing, proofs of illustration come from the dark room, right? So, yes, what is happening then is something like this. Set aside non-standard scenarios because otherwise my formalism becomes even more cumbersome. I want to speak standardly. I want to speak according to the language. I just venture this little thing, signaling that I'm not happy with it. Maybe Alberto will fix it, maybe not. We'll see what things can happen. But something different happens from my blissfully ignorant and incompetent use of proofs. Okay, so let me do it like this. I get a sentence contains unquoted occurrences like before, and quoted occurrences with the usual, what is it? J equals or bigger than 1 and K blah, blah, blah. But you know what I mean. Those indexes are supposed to be the two indexes. Here is the interesting bit. I say my sentence against the previous state as before. I get this and this. Now, the interesting bit I get to onboard is that these two are different now for the first time. So it's as if I'm saying, look, update the language according to the standard interpretation. And however, be a little bit generous just for this step of the conversation to use my strange lambda style, which I hope that thanks to your common sense, contextual clues, and so on, you figure out. So in lambda star, proofs means galleys. But lambda doesn't want to do that. I'm not proposing an interpretive update. I'm hoping that just on that occasion, on that step, you read my proofs the way I want. You read my mind, you guess, and so on. But then I'm staying prudent, right? And I'm very happy if later on Alberto says, oh yes, galleys of illustration do not come from the proof press, for example. So that's the role of true scale quotation, to prevent interpretive update, to hope for this miraculous, non-semantic, pragmatic, who knows how it happens sort of thing, just for the content, for what I'm updating common ground with, but I don't want to make any claim as to the continuation of the conversation. I'm going to use proofs because I can do better, but please, let's try to speak correctly. You will help me, or let's stop and go and both look it up, right? That's it. Yeah. And so here I get, well, all the other bits, the bits that are not in quotation marks, I'm assuming it's a standard conversation, so global English does the job, right? And in that case, there was nothing interesting. Come from, what was it, printing, all of those things, I presume they were already there. But if not, they get updated, good. And from now on, we feel authorized to use them. But lambda star is the on-the-spot temporary interpretation, right? That come from, well, this other bizarre language in which proofs means galleys, unlike English. But that bizarre language is only there at this moment. The rest remains good old lambda S. Proofs is not a thing that promotes an update. We don't, from then on, start speaking as if proofs was synonymous with galleys. I did it just at that time, but I'm not committed to continuing in that vein. And so the content, the propositional update, the classic Stomacherian update, is derived from the non-standard interpretation, and who knows how that happens, common sense, blah, blah, blah. But I don't accompany that with an invitation to linger on that interpretation. Okay? It's the best I can do, but please, let's not go on speaking like that. I would like to get proper English from now on. You do something to help me out. And so what Alberto can do is say, yeah. And the common ground gets enriched with the idea that galleys of illustration come from the darkroom, the propositional content that I was hoping him to get at, notwithstanding my inappropriate way of bringing it up. And crucially, however, with a continued standard use of proof, right? So Alberto can say something like, yes, galleys of illustration come from the dark room, which steers the conversation in a standard direction, well, continues the conversation in a standard direction. He doesn't challenge any of my proposals. I didn't propose anything. I know I said proofs, but I was apologizing for saying it, right? And from now on, oh, I got the word from Alberto, and we'll go on with galleys, the right word. Or else Alberto can do that. Oh, Alberto being equally confused as I am, right? He might have missed my apology, or he might have refused the apology. I'm like, yeah, proofs, right? Those proofs, and then he goes on using proofs in the non-standard way. Oh, then the conversation goes on into non-standard ways, but only then. And it's Alberto who's responsible for steering it into non-standard ways. And if I'm happy with what he says, from then on, I look back and think, oh, I didn't have any reason to apologize. But the interpretive update happens only here, now, when proofs is being used without apology, so to speak. And so we have now the beginning of a non-standard continuation. Only at that stage, the non-standard use of proofs enters the ensuing interpretive function, the language we are willing to speak from then on. So it's different, right? From the challenge to 4, when I said nephrologues are well paid, and Alberto says nephrologists are well paid. What's different is that there was a counter proposal. Alberto was saying, forget about your nephrologues. Here is what's happened. But with 5 is not a counter proposal because I didn't propose to update anything. Well, except for the other words, of course, but I didn't propose to update proofs, right? And so it's Alberto who has the full burden, so to speak. He is the one who's proposing to interpret proofs. And then I can do something or other, right? The usual things. And I say, look, yeah, but don't follow me that much because you remember I had my little apologetical flags and you seem to be happy to go on. Are we happy to go on like this? That sort of metalinguistic negotiation, if you want to put it in that sense. Okay, so that's the theory, right? The theory is this, pretty much. I mean, okay, apologies for the theory is this. You're able to get content into the conversation on the basis of a language, an interpretive function, without affecting future language, so to speak, because this remains the standard thing that S would do. Okay, so that's the idea. I hope it's okay. But even if it isn't, the main idea is we've got these things at our disposal. Today, little quotation marks used as true scare quotes that are there not to contribute to content, but to contribute to the means in which we will eventually, through the development of the conversation, convey further content. Right? Yeah, it would be very bizarre if language didn't have that. Because as I said, unfortunately, we are not disembodied angels. We don't just send out information. We use language, and we are not that infallible when it comes to language. We must be aware that sometimes even our linguistic means needs to be adjusted through the conversation. We don't, if you want to put it like that, speak English from beginning to end. Yeah, we adjust our little bits. Okay, and that's interesting because it might turn out that there are many other little things that need to be adjusted. Not just my inability to come up with the right word, but, well, what could go wrong? The classic case, and now I finally mention or discuss it, ambiguity. I say a word, it's an ambiguous word, and I'm afraid that Alberto will take it in the other sense, not the one I have in mind. Right? Well, I can do it. In that case, I wouldn't be a culprit. I use bat as the flying animals he thinks of the stick. Okay, his problem. I use bat perfectly fine as an English speaker. But, I mean, it would be nice to put him in the right direction, right? And so we do things like, for example, the second one. Bats, the furry flying animals, are difficult to find. My claim is that this parenthetical is not there to add information. This parenthetical is there not to talk about bats, but to talk about bats, about the world. Well, think about it. That bats are furry flying mammals. Surely it's part of common ground. It would be utterly redundant to say that to somebody as zoologically educated as Alberto, right? And so why on earth did you bother to remind Alberto that bats are furry flying mammals, since he knows that I know that he knows that I know, blah, blah, blah? Well, because there's another thing that thing is doing. And the story is longish, and I'm not going to present it now. He's not talking about bats, he's talking about the world. Same thing here, ophthalmologists, parentheses, eye doctors are rich. We do those things many times. We do it with scientific terms, right? I don't know, Chiroptera, whatever, parentheses, bats. Why? Why are you saying the same thing twice, right? Ophthalmologists and eye doctors are exactly synonyms. Why would you bother to call the same thing with the different names if all that was at issue was propositional update? It's not all that's at issue. What's at issue is a word that I'm worried my audience wouldn't be able to understand. And so I put this in. And finally, I have something else that matters in conversation, because our languages are not only difficult, and so sometimes we need to apologize. They're not only ambiguous, And so sometimes we need to disambiguate, but they're also indexical. And so another way that I'm afraid Alberto might misunderstand me is he might get the wrong context for the interpretation. And so I do this, which again would be horrendously redundant from the propositional viewpoint. Two singular terms that, and by the way, my view even really and directly refer to me. Yeah, well, I mean, how many names do you need, right? Well, yeah, but with the proper name, I fix the context. Very useful in distant communication scenarios in which the context is not apparent. And so in documents, for example, we do that kind of thing. This doesn't add anything to the proposition, but it signals what the intended context is. So all of these little things that we do that have very little to do with content and propositional update, and everything to do with the nitty-gritty of conversation, with fixing our little problems as we go along. Okay, and so perhaps this starts to sound a little bit more interesting phenomena that through scare quotations, right? You get parentheticals, by the way. Parentheticals, normally, not just this, do something which fits very well with this picture. They sneak in, they impose stuff on common ground, right? The displays in front of negation and all of that stuff. There seems to be a very nice role for a parenthetical. I'm not here to tell you that these are furry animals. I just sneak in the common linguistic background the fact that I'm going to use bat in the zoological sense and not as a stick. Okay, finally done. Thank you very much. Break or no break?
No break. We just check whether there are questions just from the audience. Let me just remind the online audience that in order to raise a question, you have to write in the chat either question or Q. I see someone already there, but okay. So Marco first.
Thank you very much. It's all very interesting, but I'm not yet convinced that there's a difference between your art example, the large canvas, and those examples of true scare quotes, because it seems to me that it's perfectly sensible to mean when you put scare quotes around art, to mean that you don't have a proper term for that shit, the canvas, and it's improper. You know it's improper, and the people you're talking to know that it's improper and so on.
Yeah, no, I'm happy with that. I'm happy with that. And as I said, right, they were supposed to be the typical readings. And so one was supposed to be the so-called kind of scenario. The one that you give me is the one that I would be more interested in, and it comes very close to mine.
No, but I want to say more than that.
Yeah.
It might be that the phenomenon you're interested in is more general than you think. So maybe you can.
Yeah, I got that. And I was thinking, yeah, that would be great. I will think about it, but yes, super. I mean, after all, I also refuse to update our conversation with calling that thing art, right? In a way. Yeah, good.
Andrea.
I was wondering what you have to say about the kind of case which is not exactly like the first one, the case of art.
Yep.
And it's not either like the case of proof, because in the case of art, it seems that there is the distancing, the echoing implies that you take the term to be used in a incorrect way, so that is not art. Whereas in the case of proof, also you are using a term not properly. And so it seems that there is something wrong with the application of the word. Whereas there can be a case in which two words have the same extension and speakers know that they have the same extension. but nonetheless, one of them thinks that it is inappropriate or it's bad in some way to use that word. So imagine that, for example, there are two words that can denote a certain group, social group of people.
Yep.
One of them is more politically correct and a certain elite university, enlightened people like it, where the other one is more like considered by them, bad. So we can imagine two parallel situations. One is that in which one of the elite people use the bad words, saying, be, right? Implying that that is not the word that the other speaker should use in that context, okay? Or we can imagine the case in which somebody which does not belong to that group use the politically correct word just to make fun of them and say,
Oh, nice.
A,
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
Okay, so in both cases,